He's very recognizable. Unfortunately, we do not have the blonde tips. I was really hoping we were going to see some blonde tips, but maybe we will see them Wednesday as AEW presents Grand Slam from Arthur Ashe Stadium in Flushing, New York. You can watch it on TBS, 8 Eastern, 7 Central, and 5 Pacific. Right now, he is scheduled to face the AEW World Heavyweight Champion, Bryan Danielson, the one and only Nigel McGuinness. And where's the blonde tips, Nigel? I was watching him eating some lunch after I pulled some weeds, planted a rose bush. I was hoping for the blonde hair today.
Steve, I will tell you this. The chances of you seeing blonde tips on my hair are about the same as you growing a full head of hair like mine.
I don't know if you have children, and I have 2.
Mm-hmm.
5, and they ask, why did you have no hair? I'm like, it's a choice. It wasn't one of those with this receding hairline. I lost the bet when I turned 21. To say there were, as you say, across the pond, not Mr. McGuinness, I had some pints, lost that battle. The head was shaved, and 22 years later, it is still here.
It will not grow back, and every morning you're forced to shave off just a couple of spots on either side. Such a tragedy of gambling.
But see, the kicker is my wife, 10 years, loves the fact that I shaved my head because for her, I did try before our wedding almost 10 years ago.
Mm-hmm.
A month, because she told me it's got to go back to shape. So I'm like, you do what the wife says, Nigel. And that's my philosophy.
The wife says. There's a Chris Rock bit, isn't there? I'm not sure if this isn't going out live, right?
No.
There's a Chris Rock bit where he goes, "They've got the pussy. We want the pussy. We'll do anything to get the pussy."
You are not wrong, my friend. Luckily, I am in my office. And very honestly, she won't even read it in English. She won't read the article. She doesn't read my stuff. I don't know why. You there? He froze. Uh-oh. Uh-oh.
All right, I think we're back.
Hey,
what happened there?
Something happened, but no, it is a Chris Rock line, though.
I think it was the word pussy shut down Zoom.
Someone must be listening. They shouldn't be listening. But no, I've thought about this a lot. And when you came into AEW and you really started, you brought up Bryan a lot. And it's like, my mind, okay, I'm smart enough and been doing this a long time. It kind of, the seeds were planted even when you debuted on Collision.
Yeah.
When did you have your final match, Bryan Danielson?
That would have been New York City, and that would have been 2000 and was it either 8 or 9, right? Because we were both signed to WWE at the same time, so we both had our final match with each other at New York City. I got knocked out and can't really remember half of what happened in the match, and I think my head was already, looking forward rather than being present in that match anyway. So this match Wednesday is going to be a very, very different experience.
What is it a factor of just not, the destination of where you guys were going back then? Was it a matter of just trying to be safe in a sport where sometimes it's harder than not to remain that way?
Yeah, I don't think it was that, to be honest with you. If I can, shoot with you, the truth of the matter is, at that point, I already had this unerring feeling because of I'd had a partial biceps tear in the past. And I think at that juncture, their doctor had asked to see new MRIs of the arm. And so my head was already spinning like, oh my God, is this going to happen? Surely there's no way after all these years. So I'm actually thinking that. And I remember warming up for the match and getting a phone call from Terry Taylor at TNA saying, I heard you being signed by WWF, or if you if you haven't, or if it doesn't work out, then give us a call because we'd love to have you. So my mind was already all over the place. So the match itself, it just wasn't what I wasn't in the right place mentally for it, certainly.
You know, and now we'll kind of like a book. You start a little forward, we'll go a little back. And, you know, before you ever stepped in the ring with Bryan, how had you heard of Bryan Danielson?
First I ever heard of that clam digger was I was at HWA in Cincinnati. That's where I started out training originally. Went back to England, came back there, and they had a developmental contract. Don't know if you remember, they had a WCW contract, then they had a
I remember
WWE
that.
contract. And when WCW got out of business, got bought out by them, they got sent up, or loads of those WCW guys got sent in there. And so I was sort of there as, I don't want to say cannon fodder, but, you know, didn't have the experience, didn't have the size. So I'd be able to train with those guys as well. And Spanky, Brian Kendrick, was also there. Yeah, great friend, great professional wrestler. And I remember after a year of being there and just not really getting any better, because, you know, I remember I did the Brian Pillman Memorial Show that year, and William Regal sat there, watched the match, and he came up to me afterwards and gave me the best piece of advice I've ever had in this job, which was, you're a British wrestler, you've got to wrestle the British style, and so you need to go back to England to do that. And so I had already started to think that maybe that wasn't the place where I needed to be to move forward in my career. And I talked to Spanky about it, and I'm like, I just don't know what else to do, where else to go. And he showed me the very first VHS cassette of the first Ring of Honor show with Bryan Danielson in the main event in that triple threat, I think with Low Key and Christopher Daniels.
Yeah.
And I went home and I watched it, and I thought, never in my fucking life am I doing that. It's fucking killing each other, you know, like, what on earth? You know, this is supposed to be fake. And but little by little, through going back to England, through watching Japanese wrestling tapes, I just started to realize and understand that this was the direction that, you know, not only could I go, I had to go. And it was a real baptism of fire to sort of develop my style in that direction. I went back to England and learned the technical British style, which was a great, you know, basis for my in-ring style, and then tried to add in elements of All Japan and New Japan and what became Pro Wrestling Noah as well, with more of that hard-hitting, realistic style that, you know, guys like Eddie Kingston have really, you know, taken on as their own now.
So looking at that, when did you guys have your first match?
My recollection, Your Honor, which is never the best, is Cleveland, Ohio. And I think you'll have to ask Abe Sapolsky about this, but I think it was only supposed to be one match. But it got over so well. And I always knew it would. And I don't know how I always knew it would. I mean, Brian's not bad. You know what I mean? If he's in there with a good guy, then he can have a decent match. But I remember the first time I saw him, they had a Ring of Honor had their first Ohio show, and I was on the show, I think, with Chet the Jet. And I got to the building early, as I always did, to help set up or, you know, whatever I needed to do. And Brian was there because he was living on the West Coast at the time. So he always flew in red eye and was there first thing in the morning as well. And he was just sat backstage reading a book like a nerd, like he is. And I just had this strange sense of not even foreboding or deja vu, the opposite of deja vu, prescience, if you will, that in some way this guy was going to have a huge impact on my career, and we were just going to be some way connected together. And it has certainly played out that way. So our first match was Cleveland, got over great, and then it just sort of went from there. You know, we had the sort of personalities that, you know, we bicker a lot, you know. Backstage we argue about things just for the sake of arguing about them as well, and that sort of chemistry plays out in the ring as well, because there is that competitive nature when you're going out there, you know, but there is also there was that sense of a friendship or a camaraderie as well from traveling up and down the roads together.
I was gonna say, like, it's like a kindred spirit type of thing, because I've watched some of those matches, and just like
Mm.
It's you get some talent, and you know this better than anybody. I can sit here, I just sit and give my opinions, but it was like oil and you guys weren't oil and water.
Yeah, yeah.
Gelled so well, and it was like it was something at that time the United States had really never seen before.
Yeah, I mean, I'll take that. Certainly, we certainly had a chemistry, no question about it. And you can think of other great rivalries, whether it was Flair and Steamboat, or Mick Foley and Terry Funk have talked about their
Yeah,
matches together. And the harder you hit each other, the more money you make. And so that's just
yeah,
seems to be the way of it. Things, it's always be a blessing in my career, certainly.
and then it seemed like you guys were always you guys were linked together. It was just Bryan and Nigel. You knew really what you were going to get.
Mm.
What would you classify as the match between you two? Like, what was the creme de la creme of what we've seen between Nigel McGuinness and Bryan Danielson?
Yeah, I don't think there's much argument. It would be that match in Liverpool that we had with the pure title against the world title, where he ran my head into the ring post 4 times and gave me a golf ball sized contusion that in the weeks following drained into both my eye socket and nearly swelled them closed.
Ooh,
So that one, yeah, that one certainly. I remember Jimmy Rave talking to me the next week, God rest his soul, and saying that that was the biggest pop he'd ever heard on a live Ring of Honor show. When after he slammed me into the ring post and pitched me into the crowd, I'd roll back in the ring and blood pouring down. I'd come up firing up like that, and the people they were just there for it, And this was, you know, it was still the burgeoning days of Ring of Honor in the sense of,
man.
that we weren't established on a world stage in that regard. It was still an underground thing. So I'm not sure how many people we had in there, but they were vociferous fans, and thank God we had them, and they were all into that. And it was truly, truly a moment that I would remember if I hadn't had my head slammed into the ring post 4 times earlier.
Right? How
Yeah.
roughly, how many matches would you say you guys had?
I think we've had, good Lord, I think we've had 8 singles, and then we've probably had about another 5 or 6, tag matches or whatever else. I'm sure, the cesspit of vitriol that the internet is, someone will come on here and tell me exactly how wrong I am with those statistics. But
And we can tell, and you know what we can do? And this is what I love.
hmm,
Do a couple different options, Nigel. You can tell them the pound sand. You could say nothing.
right.
The great thing that X and Instagram has these days, that old block and mute button.
Oh yeah. Oh,
Those
okay.
are either of those options to me is never wrong in this day of age because
Yeah. Well,
you get it more than I.
hmm.
And because I cover MMA and boxing, I always say this to talent. There's nothing like the wrestling fan. Good, bad, and indifferent.
Yeah, yeah. But the truth of the matter is, I take everything on the chin. It's someone's opinion, and they're entitled to it. Just the
Yeah,
nature of the internet, one voice sounds like 100, and
very true.
I've tried to get away from that, and I feel certainly for a lot of this next generation that have grown up with this, and this is all they know. That after every match they have, they quickly go, oh my god," and it must be heartbreaking for some of the people people say some horrific things, and I'm very lucky. I would say it's 90% positive. But and I, when I was dealing with hepatitis and a lot of the other negative things that happened in my career, the internet wasn't as big a thing as it is now. I can only imagine what it
Yeah.
would have been like, But even that, I do remember there was one person who would tweet me every week without fail on a Sunday night, going, "You've got hepatitis." Every week he'd do it, and I wouldn't respond. I wouldn't say anything. And then after about 2 months of me not responding, he just goes, "And AIDS."
Oh man, did you respond at that point or
No,
not?
no, of course not. But it just, I don't know. It speaks to the world today, perhaps, and the mental instability of human beings. But there you go. No harm, no foul. It's all right. I just want everyone to be happy.
I agree with that. And I
Mm.
remember you talked about this at the beginning of the interview about guys were both signed to WWE. This was a big deal because it was like Punk had started to really make his
Mm,
run. He had really gotten over. Joe had really gotten over in TNA. He had really established himself, and it was like, all right, it's Bryan and Nigel's time. And Bryan ended up getting his. Yours didn't for a variety of reasons. And do you ever play that what if card? I don't. A lot of people don't. People's like, oh, life
mm,
is the way it is. Would you ever sit back in retrospect and you look at what he's done, been in WWE, whether it was in AEW, and you ever kind of play that? Man, what the hell if this
mm.
with the arm, hepatitis, if this stuff doesn't happen right there, right next to him, and we're taking over the world.
I did for the longest time. Certainly for a few years after I retired, that sort of played through my head. And it was really
Yeah,
odd because here I am wrestling in 2024. And I remember even a couple of years after retiring, just thinking, well, it's too late. You know, I can't go back now. And I said it on a promo actually recently. You know, you hear that no one knows you used to be a wrestler enough, and you start to believe it. And then eventually that voice telling you is your own. And then one day, and for me, this happened a long time later, one day you realize it was your voice all along and nobody else gave a shit. You know, that's the
yeah,
truth of the matter. Mentally, as I said, the only person stopping me was me. But I did come to resolution. You know, I filmed my retirement tour. I made the last McGuinness documentary, which was an incredible experience. You know, just making the documentary and then getting it funded on Kickstarter. And just, you know, I've connected with so many people through that documentary. I wouldn't have my girlfriend now. I wouldn't have a lot of my friends. I still have people coming up to me saying how that documentary has touched their lives. And so then that pushed me in a different direction as well. That pushed me into doing commentary. And, you know, I wouldn't, part of the Magic Show, I talk about my life and my career is dealing with that moment and realizing now, and sure, it's a cliche, but that's why it's a cliche, because it is so often true that a lot of these things, the negatives in your life, push you into positive directions. And the real truth of the matter is, Steve, I'm a determinist, and a determinist doesn't
yeah,
believe in free will. And there
absolutely.
was really no choice anyway. The whole past, future of this universe is predetermined. All we're doing is sitting there and reading the book. And it looks like we've got a
Yeah,
choice, but you really can't. And so
mhm.
that gives you a sense of freedom from any negative stuff that happens. You know, there's an old allegory that Jimmy Jacobs mentioned recently to me about a farmer who had a wild horse, and his wild horse ran away, and his neighbor came up to him and said, "Oh, that's terrible, the horse has run away." And he goes, maybe. And then the next day the horse came back with two other wild horses. So the neighbor says, "Oh, fantastic, you've now got three wild horses." And he goes, "Yeah, maybe." And then the next day his son jumps on one of the wild horses, falls off, breaks his leg. The neighbor says,
Oh,
"Oh, that's terrible." And he says, maybe. The next day, the army comes in town. They're taking up all the young, you know, men off to war, and he's got a broken leg, so they don't take him. And the neighbor says, "Well, I've got great fortune." And he says, "Maybe." That's
yeah.
life. That is life.
You know, when you were commentating for NXT, you
Hmm.
know, did you guys ever cross paths? I know he
Yeah,
wasn't
there
really
was a
on
little
NXT
bit.
much, but did you ever guys ever like, whoa, hey,
Yeah, I'd sometimes be up at the pay-per-views
okay, to take over as well.
for yeah, when they'd have a takeover before, and then I'd be on the actual pay-per-view as well. Every now and again they'd have a cruiserweight match and I'd be calling that. Or alternatively, when I started out, they put me on what was that show called? Not 205 Live. It was before Raw,
The
you know,
cruiserweight, oh,
the
main event,
wraparound show. Main event. There you go. So just to get
yeah,
me get me reps, etc., etc. So he was at the venue as well. So I'd see him, but I don't know how it was for him. For me, it always felt a little odd and a little bit weird, a little embarrassing, if you will, his level of success versus now mine. Because WWE have that mentality. If it didn't happen in WWE, it doesn't matter. It doesn't
yeah,
count. And so that was really their representation of me was, you know, anything you did in the ring doesn't matter. And so for me and Bryan to be there, we just we obviously clearly were no longer on that same sort of level. And I don't know if he felt sad for me or embarrassed for me or just maybe didn't give a shit and was just glad that I had a job. I certainly was, you know.
Yeah.
But either way, yeah, we just it hasn't really been, and since I worked in AEW that we've had, you know, it's just different now. I think we've got an age where we realize that, you know, success in the ring and even money to some extent isn't the most important thing in the world, you know, because
Yeah.
ultimately when life ends, none of that matters. You know, all that really matters is experience and love.
You haven't really brought this up, but I really haven't seen anyone ask you this. And if they did, this is my apologies.
Mm.
When you were doing NXT and you were doing some of even the main roster matches,
Mm.
was there in your mind a comeback and right that wrong and get cleared and get back into the ring at that time, or that still wasn't
No,
even remotely a possibility?
not even remotely a possibility. When I had the phone
Okay.
call with WWE to come in originally, they made it abundantly clear, we're hiring you as a commentator. If you have any interest in being a wrestler, then that's not going to happen here. And I said, no problems at all. Because as I said, after the documentary and with everything else that was going on in my life, I was perfectly okay with it. And if it hadn't been for Wembley and doing Wembley Stadium, I think I probably would have been okay with it as well. If it wasn't for the fact that, you know, in 1992 I was sat there in Wembley Stadium and had an epiphany and decided that one day I was going to be a professional wrestler. If it hadn't been for that, then, you know, I wouldn't even have thought about it now. And look at where it's taken us.
And this is where we're leading. We're in that destination area. And so when you're having conversations with Tony about coming in, is it that same conversation initially of what you're having with WWE of like, we just want you as a commentator. If you want to wrestle, then you have to go somewhere else. Or was it Tony the type of guy of like, hey, let's leave this open-ended and let's just kind of see what happens?
I think in Tony's mind, when he hired me, it was solely as a commentator, but that was because, like most of, you know, the internet, he thought I wasn't able to wrestle. You know, whether it was hepatitis, which I totally cleared, or whether it was an arm injury or a neck injury, I never had one. You know, but the big difference was, unlike in WWE, as far as Tony was concerned, if it didn't happen in AEW, it absolutely happened. And he loves to draw on that because he's a real fan of professional wrestling. And I think you can make an argument that, you know, professional wrestling and sports entertainment are two different things, you know, certainly from the people who work in the different genres. You know, they may look like the same thing, and perhaps to all intents and purposes, they are. But the feeling behind them, I think, is very different.
You know, because then like you started as a commentator and you talked about that when you go to All In, the first All In at Wembley. And is it just when you're like in the mind of the, like, take a little peek behind the curtain? Like, is it just when you walk in and you're like, oh, that's kind of cool. Oh, this is amazing. This is unbelievable. It reminds me of 1992. Or is it when you're out there calling the matches and you're like, and you're getting the itch, you're getting the bug, and you're like, this could happen.
It was way before. It was way before.
Okay.
I was on Tony Khan's plane flying across to make the announcement about Wembley. When he told me about that actually the idea suddenly sprung in my mind. I just said it flippantly. You know, if it sells out, maybe I'll have to dust off the old boots. You know, just tongue in cheek comment. And Tony sparked up and asked me, "Is that a possibility? Are you able to do that?" And I said, "Sure." You know, I mean, the only thing stopping me wrestling is me. So we had the conversation then. For me, it had to be Bryan. That was the only thing that really made sense. A, because of our history, and B, because there's so much talent in AEW deserve those spots anyway, you know, and it's got to be about building these guys up. You know, I don't want to take a spot from somebody else. And so that being the case, way before we'd even gone to Wembley, the idea of me wrestling Bryan, the first show was in my head. Didn't work out because of remember he broke his arm with that elbow drop against Okada, and even though he's got 205 bones that are perfectly good, he decides that's the one reason he can't wrestle me. So that was that year, and then, you know, I remember when that happened, Tony said, "Well, maybe next year." So I just kept at it, you know, and that's part of the difficulty is I mean, here we are. What are we now? 2 days away from Grand Slam, and yeah, I know it's storyline, but the reality is Brian is very, very banged up, and I wouldn't surprise me if there were doctors in the world that would say you shouldn't be wrestling, you know.
Yeah.
But Brian's prideful, and I think if he's shown anything in his career, it's that it will take a bullet to the head to stop him getting in that ring because it's what he
Yeah.
truly loves. Yeah.
When did this match finally, because like you said, you get told, oh, maybe next year. Is
Hmm.
there any doubt that creeps into your mind where you're like, this just isn't meant to be, this isn't just meant to happen?
No, no, there never was. And I think that's because I got to that stage of peace and resolution,
Okay.
whether it happens or whether it doesn't, you know. I've heard Brian say in the past that, you know, a lot of the incredible matches that he's had that people would say are like the top of his experiences in his life, they're just they're bonuses, they're pluses, you know, they're blessings, but you don't live or die by them. I certainly don't, you know, and so I guess take it or leave it is perhaps too flippant a phrase. I obviously always wanted this match, and once I had
Yeah.
that match at Wembley and realised that I could still go, I was like, oh wow, the world had opened up to me. So I'm certainly invested. But no, I just if it happens, it happens. If it doesn't, it doesn't. I still have my own, you know, sense of self-esteem. And to your
Yeah.
point, you know, those questions of what might have been, they just don't exist anymore. You know, because it could have been 100 other things. I say it to my girlfriend all the time, you can't go back in time and choose
No.
a different path and see how it work out. And you wouldn't know that anyway, right? That whole sliding doors thing, right? You don't know what might seem to be the perfect direction might have gone in a dreadful direction. So
Mhm.
you just all you can do is hope that the direction that you did take worked out for was better than the one you didn't.
I know watching All In, I
Hmm.
was very surprised. And I see on the big screens, I see your name, and the crowd just loses, as the great Pat Patterson would say, the crowd went bananas. There's, and you talked about the internet fans earlier, the social media keyboard warriors. A lot out there of why Battle Royal? Why not the gauntlet match? Why not wait New York City, your home, where you guys had that match, where you guys put yourselves on the map in 2008,
Hmm.
the final time you guys had stepped into the ring? Why London and not New York City?
Yeah, well, that's certainly above my pay grade, and it's probably too much of a nuanced conversation to really,
Yeah.
you know, sum up here in 5 minutes on an interview. But I will say this, and this is from someone who works inside the industry, who sees the inner machinations of putting a show together. It is incredibly complex, and there are
Mhm.
so many people's egos and directions and betterment that is involved. There's storylines with 20, 30 other people that have already been thought of, you know, which arguably are more important than my own as well. And you can take any individual storyline and look at it individually and go, oh, well, why did they do that? They shouldn't have done that. But you don't know what's
Yeah.
happening over here that made them have to do that. And more importantly, if you're trying to juggle all these things at the same time, I'd love to see anyone. I'd love to see anyone sit in Tony Khan's chair and do the job that he does because he does it 24/7. I couldn't do it,
Yeah.
you know what I mean? And
No.
that's not to say, you know, that he's perfect by his own admission. I'm sure he's not, but he loves this job. He loves professional wrestling, and without him and without EW, so many of us would not be able to work in this industry and feed our families. So it's, as I've always said, it's very easy to find issue and with anything.
Exactly.
It's just the entertainment industry, right? What was that Game of Thrones, right? The last
Mhm.
season of Game of Thrones, especially the last episode, people went mad over it, right?
That
And
was rough.
again, we can discuss it until the cows come home, but we don't know what the situation is. We don't know why
Yeah.
it turned out that way. And all you can do is you can just vote with this, just vote with this or
You're right
this,
on that one.
right? That's it, and that's the way it should be. I think there's far too much negativity, too much vitriol, because
Mhm.
it doesn't it affects you, what you put out into the universe. It just comes back at you, and if you are negative It just comes back around. It's how you see the world. It's how you see yourself.
That reaction was amazing. A lot of big moments happened in that match alone.
Mm.
You come out, the debut of Ricochet. You see everything with Hangman Adam Page. But the crowd, you were the one they stuck with the entire way. Now it wasn't just, oh, he's in. Yay, we're excited, we're happy, and then it's the next guy, and everyone's like the same way. But it stayed, it was really consistent throughout the entire match. Were you is that a career highlight for you just because you hadn't been in the ring 15 years? And you come out, no one knows you're coming out, and you just get this reaction. Looked like you hadn't missed a beat, and the fans were behind you from A to Z.
Yeah, a lifetime highlight, certainly. Given what I said about how, these moments are just blessings and additions to your life, that was one that just was such a full circle moment for me. I've said to people, the whole world now just seems like a surreal alternate universe of how many years I've had to feel like, okay, well, my life didn't work out exactly as I wanted, and I didn't get the chance to wrestle at Wembley Stadium, and hang, there you are. It's when you have that moment, it just makes you feel eternally blessed. It really did.
Did they give you the confidence that you needed? But did they give you like a boost of confidence of like, okay, if this match does happen, Bryan Danielson, I'm going to be ready. I'm not going in 2 feet into the ocean. I got the feet wet already, and I can prepare, and I'll be ready to go.
Yeah, there was part of that, certainly. And you can certainly look at that again, talking about, the decision why this and why that. Probably a good match to have back after 15 years rather than
Yeah.
a long drag out one-on-one encounter, certainly. But either way, I was ready because I prepared. They say, failing to prepare is preparing to fail. And for the last 18 months, ever since I realized it was an option, I've been getting in the ring. I've been working on my diet. I've been lifting. I've been stretching. I've been doing everything I can to be in tip-top condition if and when the opportunity presents itself. So I've got that level of confidence, that's always been the case. But to your point, yeah, that reaction was fantastic, because I think that's the big fear for anyone, any form of entertainment. If you don't get the reaction that you were looking for, then you go, oh God, when I do the magic show, sometimes lines hit and sometimes they don't, and you go, oh, I'm not sure about that one. But yeah, it was incredible. And for Wembley Stadium as well, I'd never obviously wrestled in front of a crowd that big before. The biggest I'd ever done was, I don't know if it was Diffa Ariake or the Tokyo. I don't think we ever did the Tokyo Dome in Japan with Noah. But either way, the biggest shows I did was about 20,000 people. And I remember doing something and then there being no reaction whatsoever and going, ooh, that was weird. And then you hear the reaction.
Yeah.
And it's just because it's so much bigger. It's really probably only 2 seconds before the reaction comes back in, but it sort of throws you off your game. And so you would think at a stadium like Wembley Stadium, that would be, but good Lord, no. The second I walked out and just heard them, I was just like, this is it. And then you're in this weird sense of autopilot. It's like you're in your head. And I wonder if this is, like bands who've done the same sort of songs, or for a majority of their career, they get in that place where you're almost on an automatic pilot, and you're in your head and you can see the words coming out and you can see the movement and the action, but you're not making those choices and those decisions. And to come back to determinism, it almost feels as though it is all being driven by the scientific laws of the universe. It's profound, really, truly profound.
A couple more questions, Nigel. And thank you so much for this extended time. It's
No
definitely greatly
worries.
appreciated.
Yeah.
I appreciate you and AEW really doing this for us. And
Thank you.
my favorite, I've watched all the videos, the countdown to Grand Slam. My 2 favorite lines, and I have them right here just so I didn't forget them. I'm going to read them. Brittle Bryan Danielson, it's the fragile countdown. Now, my 8-year-old, the fragile countdown is pure brilliance. He goes, Dad, he's like, I gave him just a snippet of the story. And he's like, because he heard the final countdown at All In. He's like, okay, I can get that. He's like, that's really catchy. I like that. The brittle Bryan Danielson, I gotta admit, he was pretty sad about it. He was pretty mad. He was pretty upset. But and he doesn't get it because he's 8. But
Right.
how does it take in your mind to do that? Because you're wearing the shirt. The shirt is absolutely magnificent of Brian Fears Nigel. And then you bust out, it's the fragile countdown and brittle Bryan Danielson. Pure brilliance, Mr. McGuiness. I have to do a big clap there because it was.
Thank you very much. Yeah, I mean, it's most of my waking day, I spend time thinking about how I can mock and lambast Bryan Danielson, to be perfectly honest with you. When I watch movies, I'm looking for little inside jokes, one-liners and stuff like that. And to me, that is your job as a commentator, certainly as a color commentator, as opposed to a play-by-play guy, is to give that sort of detail, complexity, nuance to what you're seeing in the ring. As a former wrestler yourself, you're trying to keep everything whole, in terms of what they're doing. But just as a color commentator, you're just trying to diversify. You're trying to make people look at things from a different way. And so to that end, any little jabs I can get in at Brian, make someone laugh, make someone joke. I don't have it with me now. I was in England, obviously, for All In. I did a magic show there. We sold out a lovely little pub in Fulham. And one of the guests that I had on stage, bless her, Midge or Pidge, I think she went by, during the intermission, she ran back to her parents who had come there with her, and she came back and she gave me a little bracelet that she'd made before the show, and all it said on it was "Shut up, Nigel." And she says that every week when she watches Collision, her and her family, that's what they always say. Every time I get a one-liner, "Shut up, Nigel." And
you're making it different.
Yeah, you're connecting with people, and even if it's only a moment like that. There was another fella who reached out, and I hope he's doing well. Danny, my thoughts are with you. He had was diagnosed with terminal cancer, and he managed to make it down to Wembley to see it, and just saying that gave him even just a momentary respite. It's I'll never be able to overestimate how blessed I am to be able to touch people in that way.
100% of what all you guys and girls do is, it's very, you're touching hearts, you're touching souls, and whether wrestlers or not, they're making more of a difference than they actually think they do. And I want to go back just one thing, because I was sitting there thinking about it a couple questions ago, and I wish I would have asked it earlier. When you're watching Brian, I don't know how much you watched got on top in WWE and had the run that he did, and then he had to retire, and then he came back. And how did you feel about getting that moment at WrestleMania, 70,000 people, and then it wasn't long to where he had to basically give it up? And what did you feel, if anything, when he was going through those trials and tribulations?
Yeah, it's complex. It's a complex discussion, certainly. You feel as a human being, certainly. And you feel as someone who's suffered setbacks in their own life as well. That sense of sympathy or empathy, I forget which one is correct in that term. But I didn't follow wrestling when I retired, and I was just working for Ring of Honor. When I work for a company, I just watch what goes on in that company, and I don't watch anything else. Now, because of social media now, you kind of can't avoid certain things because they get plugged through to you. But generally speaking, I won't watch. I didn't watch AEW when I was in WWE, and I don't watch WWE now. I'm in AEW. And I just think that's your job. Whoever you're paid by, and that's it. So when I was in WWE, I obviously was paying attention to what was happening with Brian at that time, and felt for him. He, I'm sure, identifies. You may have even told me that parable that I mentioned earlier about the farmer, and he's had some incredible highs and some incredible lows, which I'm sure he could tell you as well as I could. And so I felt with him, certainly, but I think it's hard. I know a lot of people who watch from the sidelines, who maybe have never even been in a wrestling ring, or have never been in a movie, or any of these people that we sort of, vaunt as the epitome of success. And you go, yeah, well, but they've got millions of dollars, and they've got, at least they don't have to worry about paying their mortgage and their rent, etc., etc. And as much as I hate to say it, I think there is an element of truth to that. I can speak for myself now that I have this incredible job at AEW that I'm well paid for, taken care of creatively. It's the best job I've ever had in my life. And I don't want to tempt fate, but if something negative happens in my life, I don't have to worry about paying my rent. I don't have to worry about, oh my God, am I going to have to get a job and not know how am I going to make my child support, or you know what I mean? A lot of things that the average person on the street really struggle with, thank God, I and Bryan don't have to deal with. Now, that doesn't mean that, ending your career of something that you've always loved ever since you were a child isn't traumatic and difficult.
Yeah.
But you do have a sense of safety. You have a safety net. And I think that certainly goes a long way, But to that point, even though I've reached a level of success now, I truly believe that while people cheer Bryan as the epitome of the underdog that shouldn't have achieved everything he did. I mean, he says in his autobiography how he had so many physical ailments, medical ailments in his childhood that were it not for modern medicine, he would have died 50 or 100 years ago. He called himself a defect, right? That's how he titled his own self. And so they look at him that way as a success, and they read his book and they cheer for him. But my story is their story, someone who had these dreams and just was, through bad fortune or whatever, was unable to achieve them. And I think there's an undercurrent of that. And through the people who've watched my documentary, which is just telling that story, you always hear the story about the people that made it. You'd never hear the stories about the ones that don't. And arguably, it's the stories of the people that don't make it that are far more important to the majority of people on this earth, because that's the life you're going to live. You're going to have setbacks and these dreams coming from someone who had that moment at Wembley Stadium as well. I guess if anything, it shows, and Jimmy Jacobs really believes this, that as long as you keep going and you don't give up, you will get a modicum of success. And you may never realize it how. Now, there's always going to be exceptions to the rule, and I hate to get philosophical, because you can look at Jay Briscoe as one of the greatest professional wrestlers of his generation. I don't think anybody would argue about that, but never got to wrestle on that stage. And again, we can go into the details of why and argue whether that was valid or otherwise, but be that as it may, it took Jay Briscoe's death to be accepted on that sort of level, and the tragedy of him passing the way that he did, it's hard to look at that and go, okay, well, he never gave up and he achieved his dreams, etc., etc. There's always going to be outliers like that, but again, I'll just come back to determinism and saying that we've all got our story that is being told, and we can just hope for the best. We sit at the table, we roll our dice, and we get what we get.
You talk about the story. The story leads to Arthur Ashe Stadium. It leads to Grand Slam, to the match many people feel wasn't going to happen again for a variety of reasons. You could say health issues, different being at different promotions, et cetera, et cetera. Even before you enter the ring, do you feel this is the apex coming up at Arthur Ashe Stadium, highlighting that AEW Dynamite Grand Slam, the hype this has gotten? I know AEW is doing media all over New York City and in different outlets, especially like this one. Do you feel X for Nigel McGuiness coming up on Wednesday?
It'd be hard not to, for me, certainly. Given my opponent, given our history, and just given Father time as well. Bryan is legitimately banged up. His neck is screwed. He's probably going to have surgery. I would say he's definitely going to have surgery. And whether he'll ever wrestle again afterwards remains to be seen. You know, I think he's stupid enough to try. But be that as it may, you know, I think we will look back on this match, and certainly for me, it will be the pinnacle of my story. And whatever happens as the outcome of that, win, lose, or draw, I'll be able to say that I, you know, had a dream that was unimaginable to that boy that sat in Wembley Stadium and first vowed to be a professional wrestler.
What is it? You know, we all know this, and you've brought it up a couple times about his health, and the final countdown literally is Bryan Danielson. And what does it mean to you? The fact that he could go out, guys, that can call this shot. He can go. He could have went a couple different ways.
Mm.
And centered back to what put him on the map, what got him to the dance, what the matches that led him to getting the contract that he did always want, that propelled him into superstardom. And yet he's, as part of his final countdown, going to an old foe, an old nemesis, an old rival, an old friend, compadre, and Nigel McGuinness.
Yeah, I don't know how much of the decision is his, to be perfectly honest. I had, you know, I had quite a way of twisting his arm into the match, to be perfectly honest with you. You know, I think given his physical limitations and his neck, the last thing he ever wants to do is take a lariat from me. He knows how much, you know, comes with that. And so I think that there's probably some trepidation in Bryan. You'd have to ask him yourself about facing me from a physical standpoint, probably from an emotional standpoint as well. But I think that is what will translate once the bell rings, if he does indeed show up at Arthur Ashe Stadium. I know he's going to be there, but he's obviously got to get cleared by the doctors beforehand. But if he's in the ring, I just think people are just going to latch onto that. You know, the real true roots of the story between us, and his physical condition and my desire to prove that I'm every bit as good as he was. You know, it's palpable. It's as real gets.
And well, I want this is I feel this last one is I think the perfect way to end. You talked about his end. Is this the final countdown, the final one for Nigel McGuinness?
I can't say. I cannot say. Everybody wants to end their career on a high, and for me, it was always a bitter pill to swallow. And I don't want to take anything away from, you know, the last show that I did or my opponent that night, because just to get in the ring and be a professional wrestler, I think is a success. But, you know, it was a volunteer fire department in West Virginia. There were fans. You know, one of my fans, great guy, Greg, a huge Ring of Honor fan, drove all the way from New York City to West Virginia just to see my last match. So I was very, very touched. There was a few other people who did the same sort of thing. But at the same time, I never would have imagined when I sat in Wembley Stadium that my final match was going to be in front of a very small crowd there in West Virginia. And so that was a bitter pill for me to swallow, because I didn't want that to be my last match. And I think part of me wanted to do that, you know, to thumb my nose at fate and destiny and say, all right, well, this is it. And this is my final match. Surely, if anybody gives a shit, surely this isn't going to be my final match. And for the longest time, people didn't. And, you know, without Tony Khan, then it would have been, you know. And while I did come to terms with that, if my last match is at Arthur Ashe Stadium, beating Bryan Danielson finally and setting any doubt that I was at least on his level, then, you know, how'd you follow up on that? I could take that one to the grave.
Why isn't this? Well, before we go, I have to ask, why is this not a world title match?
Well, quite simply, I tried
as a fan, I need to know.
Yeah, I tried to get a title opportunity at Wembley Stadium, and I didn't win the match. You know, so what is it saying to the fans, to the other wrestlers in AEW? If I enter a match to earn a world title match, don't earn it, and then get awarded a title match in my next match, that makes no sense whatsoever. right? Beyond that, Darby Allin had his title opportunity against Bryan. He was convinced through speculation alone from Jon Moxley that Bryan Danielson wasn't going to be able to compete. So gave up that title opportunity at that point, instead putting that title opportunity on the line against Jon Moxley. If I then saunter up to Tony Khan and say, Tony, you know, Bryan might show up. If he is, can I have a title opportunity against him? Well, of course, Bryan. Of course, Nigel. Here you go. That doesn't make any sense either. And because to me, this isn't about the AEW world title. As prestigious as it is, I don't want to win that title because I don't want to have to represent the company as world champion. I don't have the sort of ego like Bryan Danielson where I have to be the face of every company that I work for. I'm perfectly happy in my station in life. But when the opportunity presented itself for me to wrestle Bryan, if he's okay to go and prove what I've said all along, I've got to take it. And that's what I said to Tony. And he thought, well, okay, if the opportunity presents itself and Bryan can go, Darby's given up the opportunity. So there you go, Nigel. It's on a plate for you. So that, Stephen, is quite simply the reason why this is not an AEW world title match.
That to me was just, I know that was just always a head scratcher for me. But now, see, you made it make sense. Follow. Yeah, it's like sometimes I feel like it's a cesspool, and my mind gets. Sometimes your mind gets diluted a little bit, and you're looking, you're like, okay, that point isn't bad. You know what? John says this is good. Marty says this isn't bad. Then I snap back into my journalist head, and I'm like, there's a rhyme and reason this makes sense, and I get the opportunity to ask Nigel McGuinness why this opportunity, why it's not for the AEW World Title, and to me that makes the most sense in the entire universe. You can watch Nigel McGuinness. Hopefully, we're all hoping. Nigel McGuinness this coming Wednesday night. AEW presents Grand Slam from Arthur Ashe Stadium in Flushing, New York. You can watch it live on TBS, 8 Eastern, 7 Central, and 5 Pacific. I have a hit list when I come out and start a year with interviews. I never thought this would be possible because I never thought you were coming back to the ring. And I knew it was possible when you came back and returned at All In. And then I had to ask the great PR man from AEW, John Schneider, I need Nigel McGuinness. Sports Illustrated needs him. The fans need him. We need to hear Nigel's words of what led up to this big moment for you on a personal level and the history, because it's a history that it's honestly a history, Nigel, that really hasn't been much.
It's hard too, yeah, in such a limited amount of time, for sure. Yeah.
So when you guys were awesome with this time. So it definitely means a lot to me. It's going to mean a lot to the readers, and it's greatly appreciated. I'm looking forward to Grand Slam. It's being sold, Nigel. A lot of people want to see you give brittle. I'm going to talk to Bryan soon, I think. You got to beat down brittle Bryan Danielson. Is he going to show up, Nigel? You said he's going to be around New York City. Man enough.
Yeah, we'll find out. You can ask him yourself, right? You're going to ask him before?
I will not talk to him beforehand. But
you won't.
Unfortunately. But you were because you were the one I wanted. You were the superstar I needed.
There you are. Right. Yeah. He's hard to get, Bryan Danielson. It's hard to get him away from his clam digging schedule, you know.
Clams. See, why would one want to dig clams?
I think it's a ridiculous pastime if you're honest. I think he grew up in Washington State. He did it with his father, so there's a sense of nostalgia. But what a miserable way to spend a day at the beach, right? Standing there with your little, Jod Potters and your shoes and your little spade there, clubbing down and really just, committing mollusk murder. What does it say about the man?
There's better things to do.
Yes.
If you're on the beach, you get some sun, dip your feet in the water, maybe a swim, you just drink a pint.
There is no excuse for Bryan Danielson.
This guy. You like Guinness?
Do I like Guinness? Yeah, I love a pint of Guinness. Well, to be perfectly honest with you, I haven't drunk in a while because I'm,
look at lean and mean.
Ready to go.
I always have to ask British talent that question. Because to me, there's only one way. There's only one beer to drink. But this has been a pleasure. This has been an honor, Nigel, for taking so much time today. It means a lot. It is greatly appreciated. I am looking forward to AEW Grand Slam coming up this Wednesday night, Arthur Ashe Stadium, live on TBS, 8 Eastern, 7 Central, and 5 Pacific. You kick Bryan Danielson's ass. And maybe one day, Nigel, we'll talk and maybe we'll say how you were the one. You were the man that ended Fragile Countdown.
Let's hope so.
Brittle Bryan Danielson. Thank you, Nigel, and hopefully we can talk again sometime in the future.
No doubt about it. See you, mate. Peace.